there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's November 2010, and Christopher Rowe and his girlfriend Coralie Ann are on holidays in Queensland, enjoying the spring sun and some downtime ahead of the busy Christmas period. He reads something online from his hometown of Kapunda, South Australia. 3 people have been found dead. He notices a photo attached to the article is of his street, so he jumps on Facebook. "My family live on that street," he writes. "Can somebody check on my parents?" Pretty quickly, he gets a reply. "All's good," someone writes. Relieved, Chris gets back to his holiday. But it doesn't take long for the truth to come out, for that well-meaning and misinformed local's comment to be proven wrong. As Chris answers a phone call from a detective, he can hardly believe what he is hearing. His mum Rose, dad Andrew, and little sister Chantelle have all been stabbed to death in his family home.
Now, an 18-year-old man will face court today over the murder of a family in the South Australian town of Kapunda.
Andrew and Rose Rowe and their 16-year-old daughter Chantelle were found stabbed to death in their home last week.
A large crowd of locals gathered outside the police station to hear from detectives.
The crime will be described in the media as a bloodbath, disturbing, confronting. All 3 victims stabbed multiple times. The brutality of the crime shocks the local community, which is thrown into the global media headlines. To this day, it's described as one of the state's most savage crimes and resulted in one of the harshest penalties handed down in South Australian history. Kapunda is a rural Australian town, which at the time of the murders had a population of about 3,000. It sits on the edge of the Barossa Valley, an hour north of Adelaide, and is what you might call a low-level tourist destination. It's home to Australia's first commercial metal mine, which you can now tour. It's a stereotypical Aussie town in that everyone knows everyone, and many of the locals live there their entire lives. At the time of this crime in 2010, there were only 2 police officers stationed there permanently. The last thing they expected to find inside the Harriet Street home in the early hours of November 8th was this. The victims had more than 100 wounds between them. The man responsible was someone no one would have expected capable of such a horrific triple murder. Bryan Littlely is a journalist who covered this case extensively for The Advertiser. He knew Kapunda well and kept in touch with the sole survivor Chris for many years after the crime. Bryan joins us now. Bryan, tell me about the Rowe family. Who were they and what did their life in Kapunda, South Australia look like?
I think the Rowe family, there was Andrew, the father, and Rose, Mary, or Rose, that she went by. Typical country family, 2 children, Christopher, who had moved out of home and was living with his girlfriend, but nearby, and they'd have their weekend catch-ups. And then, of course, Chantelle, the 16-year-old, in the midst of her schooling, but also looking to branch out and do some work, casual work around in the community or in the towns, getting those cafe jobs or little jobs to earn some pocket money and getting around, seeing her high school friends. So they were your typical country family, had been living in Kapunda for some time, not born and bred through Kapunda, but had set up and were established in the town and known around the town as good, friendly, kind people and nice members of the community.
Do we know anything about the weekend before the murders, what the family was up to? I know Chris was out of town, wasn't he?
Yes, well, Chris was with his girlfriend, Coralie, on the Gold Coast, had gone there for a holiday, and I think he'd been there for close to a week away. Andrew and Rose, there's not much known about what they had been up to across that weekend. We know that the week before, Bill O'Brien, who was at that stage running to be mayor and went on to become the mayor and has been a long-standing mayor, is still mayor or closely associated with the local government council there at the moment. Bill's a lovely bloke, ran the supermarket, but he'd said that he'd run into Rose the week before and had a chat with her in his supermarket in the main street of Kapunda. So they were moving around doing their normal thing, but, not standing out. Chantelle, we know that she'd been across that weekend in a few little places or speaking to a few people, a party at the neighbouring town of Freeling, we think. There's also other parties in Kapunda and bits and pieces. So moving around with friends groups and catching up with friends groups is how it played out, or what we learnt about Chantelle's movements, and that's critical going on later on.
The bodies of Rose, Andrew and Chantelle, who was only 16, were found on a Monday in November 2010. Do we know if anyone raised the alarm or how that crime scene was discovered?
Look, from what we understand, it was actually Christopher's boss who had gone to check. I'm not sure about the details of him and why he would have gone to check, but he'd gone to call in on the family home somewhere around 11 o'clock on Monday, the 8th of November, maybe to drop something in, just to say g'day, something like that. And he discovered the bodies of Andrew or discovered the scene, I should say, with Andrew, Rose and Chantelle, as we know now, brutally murdered and stabbed. It was a seasoned police call it now the most horrific scene that they've ever seen.
I don't want you to go, into too much detail that you're uncomfortable with, but to help us set the scene, what happened to that family in that house?
Yeah, I think, I've had this explained to me by some police who were in there, who were first on the scene. And as I said, they talk about it being the most brutal and horrific scene that they'd ever seen. We know that it came out in court, the details about that scene read out by Judge Sewell, when they were finally prosecuting and sentencing the killer, Jason Downie, that Chantelle had been stabbed 33 times and raped to the point where she'd been stabbed and wasn't killed and then raped and then stabbed again. Andrew was stabbed 24 times in the back, and from what police have described to me, or some people I've heard through those channels in those investigations, Andrew didn't have a chance of even getting out of the bed and was rendered incapable of being able to defend his family, I guess. For me, I think as horrific as both of those ends are, I think it's a description of what happened to Rose, who was stabbed more than 50 times, which really impacts me and would impact anyone. She was said to be crawling on the ground, trying to escape the madness that was happening in and around her when she was stabbed again and again. The efforts by the killer to clean up the mess and then only to go back and stab people again for blood to fall over that mess again and again. So it was a frenzied, crazy attack, which is just mind-boggling to think that someone could even continue to be in such a rage or such a out-of-control state.
Well, that's more than 100 stab wounds alone. And, any murder is horrific, but, that visceral language that you described the police officers using, disturbing, confronting, a bloodbath, a massacre, it doesn't get more brutal and horrible than this.
No, it doesn't. And I've got to say that, those details they weren't put up early on in the piece. It's only over time that those details really started to come out, I guess, after the court case as well, and they started to flow out, and we heard more murmurs of what police had been confronted with when they were the first into the scene. And I've got to assume that, those police officers, hardened police officers who've seen a lot, were and still are probably struggle to cope with what they saw in that house. So very disturbing.
I've read reports that a neighbour actually heard some screaming that night, but didn't end up reporting it. Were there many other kind of witness reports that came out?
Yeah, that was one of the things that had very early in the police investigation, that at about 1 a.m. in the morning, a neighbour had heard, I think, Andrew's loud voice, some screams from one of the ladies, one of the girls, and that is in the police sort of investigation from the very outset that was something that had triggered. Other than that, there was very little from that night that would alert anyone to a crime happening in that town. I think the person may have thought it was a domestic dispute and nothing more, but it wasn't an ongoing cries for help or scenes. It was you could just imagine a father rendered incapable of protecting his family, whether he was already dead, a terrified young teenage girl. She was hiding under the bed. He pulled her out from underneath the bed and stabbed her again. And a mum who was unable to escape this madman. What was going on inside that house, whether they couldn't scream in fear, in shock, incapable of doing that at that time.
My mind immediately goes to Chris, who wasn't there, and he was on holiday with his girlfriend. I'm assuming he got a call. Do we know how he found out, how quickly he was able to make it back?
Yeah, we know that he did get a call, obviously got a call and was alerted to it, and I believe he was able to get back by that Monday afternoon or evening. He was raced back there. Raced back to what? His whole family had been murdered. And, I spent a bit of time with Chris as in the years after. It was 3 years after that I spent time with Chris and Coralie, and it was the last real touch point I had on this story was to do an interview with the pair as they awaited the birth of their child, and it was lovely to be sitting there and doing that. I'd had a little bit of contact with Chris throughout that time, but obviously family and friends, community, police, all of those people you'd expect were very protective of him, and I'd like to think that I respected that, and our coverage respected that as well. We did a lot of our liaison with the family through Chris's cousin, Kylie Duffield, and she became a real powerful and strong and fantastic spokesperson for the family. The torment that Chris went through, even to the point of, while he had an absolute alibi in the Gold Coast, had he organised the killing of his family, and what, or had he was he up to something that led them to be attacked? It would have been so tormenting. And, he was a really strong and powerful young man at the time to be able to even cope with that and get through. He raced back, and I know that he was a pillar of strength for the people around him. I mean, he had a lot of people around him to support him as well, though, but he stood fairly strong in the circumstances.
Was Kapunda, regularly in the news? It's as far as I can see, a bit more of a sleepy rural town, a little bit of a tourist location, but this would have kind of really put it on the map.
Yeah, like for the wrong reasons. Yeah, no, Kapunda is a fabulous place. It's a lovely, sleepy country hamlet, really. It has a really rich history and probably I imagine it's had its fair share of trouble and strife, but nothing like this. So, it's part of the Copper Triangle with the Cornish miners, and so it had the copper mine there. And at one stage, I think the number of pubs in Kapunda there was somewhere around 30 pubs in Kapunda, and even at this stage in 2010, there was still a lot of little pubs in there. So you can imagine the rough and tumble. It's a rough and tumble town. It's got a rich Catholic history. It's also got a number of tunnels that run below the town. Very intriguing township, but nothing like this.
You said you were tasked with, chatting to the locals as part of your team's investigation. What was their reaction like to something like this happening in the town? At the start, as you mentioned, we didn't know the details, but they did know that 3 members of a family had been killed in the one house.
Utter shock at that and devastation that, you know, a family from their community had been, you know, so horrifically murdered. And as it filtered out, of course, there's that immediate grief and outrage. Then the fear really set in because, and it was within a few days, I think, that the township of Kapunda started to sort of work out that, hey, this isn't likely to be, well, they thought it was someone from outside of town. It would have to be, wouldn't it? Because no one in their town, that the people that they live with, their neighbours, isn't going to do anything like this. But within a few days, the efforts of the police were starting to steer that way, that we think this could be one of your own. And that level of fear really rose. So they were quite scared. I think walking around the town, people did try to go about their lives as per usual and try to keep that face of, you know, we're getting along with things. We're supportive of every effort that the police make, but then you've got media from everywhere. All the eyes are on it. So everyone was on tenterhooks and they were scared. So even I found myself knowing a lot of people there, they were reserved in what they might come forward with and a bit frightened about talking with you. And so it made it pretty hard.
Were the police sharing any clues in those early days, or were they kind of keeping things pretty under wraps? I know that there was a really widespread search, you know, underwater, land, everything.
I know that over time I've been critical of police, and at the time I was critical of police because not about keeping things under wraps. I understand that that's the way that things need to be. And something that was quite of interest to me was the head of major crime, Grant Moyle. He'd been in the job for 2 days before this murder happened. And, you know, I know Grant Moyle from, he's a few years older than me, but he grew up in the same township as me, and my mum used to babysit him.
Oh.
There was this journo cop battle, like you're the investigative editor, Bryan, but I'm the investigator. So there's always been that with police. I think that police did a good job from the outset in putting together a plan to try to, that would likely capture the suspect or the likely suspect. It's just that this crime was different. So I think what they would normally go into trying to capture a person, they looked in the wrong spots to start with early. But are they the wrong spots? Probably not. That's how you'd approach it. I don't think anyone believed that it was someone from Kapunda that would have done that. So certainly not the person it turned out to be. But police weren't doing the things that you might expect them to do from the start. So there was a security guard, security patrol who patrolled Kapunda and would have been the most likely person to go to ask for, had you seen anything? He'd been out that Sunday night. In fact, he responded to an alarm at the Kapunda Primary School at around 10 o'clock on the Sunday night. You know, it turns out that primary school's a couple of blocks shy of where Jason Downie lived at the time. But police hadn't even been to the local security patrol guy to say, did you see anything? The one person who, you know, had reason to be driving around Kapunda late at night on a Sunday night, they didn't particularly go to the people that Chantelle had contact with over that weekend. So Chantelle was the only person that you could closely track where she went from place to place and what she was doing. So I made a discovery some 3 or 4 days into that investigation that they hadn't spoken to Chantelle's boss, who she'd messaged not more than 2 hours before she was murdered, to say that she wouldn't be at work the next day. It was in a neighbouring town in Uriutpa, a place that I know, Cafe Divine. She'd worked there for a week, but even the cafe operator, the boss, who had the message on her phone from Chantelle saying, I'm not going to be in tomorrow, I feel crook. Police hadn't spoken to her, and she was flabbergasted at that. Why wouldn't they speak to her if you're going to try to track these movements? So, yeah, police did a good job in the circumstances. I think they'd do a lot better job knowing that this is the crime that happened and what had happened. So the debrief would have set some new parameters, I think.
Well, it did take, 8 days or so to arrest their suspect. Was Jason Downie's name floating around, do we know now, from the start? Was he an early person of interest?
Well, certainly not in the police eyes. As you know, I think if he was a person of interest, they would have had him in there earlier to speak with him at least. And the circumstances of him being brought in even suggests that, even then they weren't too sure that he was the right person. They were just going on a bit of a hunch. But I guess, his actions certainly to go and put flowers at the gravesite and move around and go back to work normally and work each day, activities that he didn't stand him out as a person of interest. No one was jumping up and down and saying, we think it's him. But I think there was one event in that week, in that 8 days, that certainly some eyes had started to turn towards him as if he might be the person that had some involvement in it. There was a Christmas party that he went to with his workplace, and they looked at him, one of the girls there, partner of one of his fellow mechanics at this Christmas party, took a photograph of him because they thought that he was acting oddly and strangely. And she sent this photograph to us in the days shortly after Jason Downie's arrest, and we couldn't run it for some months until he'd appeared in court. But the explanation from the girl who made contact and sent that photograph to me, she said that I took it because I thought that he'd killed those people.
That's kind of creepy, isn't it?
It's really creepy, and the photograph, it didn't help Jason Downie's cause to look anything of innocence because it was the days when you didn't have the red eye flash reducer. So, this photograph, it's striking. He's got these devil eyes in it as well. So when we did run that photograph eventually after he'd appeared and the suppressions on his identity were lifted, it was a face, unmasking a face of evil. So, and it certainly, the photo did sit there appropriately to paint the picture of an evil person.
You mentioned something briefly that I wanted to bring back up. The fact that he visited the flowers, the shrine, that was kind of caught on, like you could watch that. It's on video. It's on news camera footage. And it's kind of, It's very eerie to look at in retrospect. He visits and stands there for ages and gives a gift.
Yeah, and wrote something. I can't recall exactly what he wrote on that note. But, as I said, the media pack was there day and day, 24/7 pretty much, in Kapunda, and going to different locations, going to the lake that they had searched, the police had searched, and going for press conferences there. So there's always cameras on that house and cameras on the locations where police were searching, cameras on people in the streets as the police moved through there. So it's not surprising that they captured that footage, but obviously that became quite a piece of valued footage across newsrooms and I think also for police when they were trying to get an understanding of who they were dealing with once they had finally caught Jason Downie, what type of person they were dealing with, someone who could act so blasé. And I guess it probably supports the fact that police didn't have any leads on. You didn't see him outrightly as someone that they should be focusing on, because to be able to move through the community like that in a time of grief and purport to be grieving and he'd gone and visited the boyfriend of Chantelle Rowe, the person that, one of only a few friends that Jason Downie had. He went and visited him within 2 days of the murder and acted as if, he grieved with him, was quiet and reserved, described by Dylan Pratt, that boyfriend, as, typical of Jason, a bit quieter than normal. But, wow, I mean, the guy, is cold-hearted?
Mm. So that's the connection, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit about Jason? Because he is friends with Dylan and Chantelle is Dylan's girlfriend. That's the kind of link.
Yeah, so Jason Downie he didn't have many friends through high school, and he was doing this apprenticeship, and he did 1 day a week at TAFE. So I do think he'd sort of finished his schooling before matriculation, and he'd gone into this trade. But he didn't have a great life in Kapunda. He'd emigrated there in 2006 with his mother, Lorna, from Kilmarnock, and had a brother, Jamie, who also lived there with the family or close by, and worked close by down at Gawler in, I think, as a stable hand or track work rider, a jockey, if you like. But he had very few friends, Jason Downie. He wasn't one who made friends. He did try to act the cool guy. From all accounts, he was trying to purport himself as a bit of a basketball star and a gun mechanic, and popular. But he'd had an infatuation with his best mate's girlfriend, and Chantelle didn't shut that down particularly, because she didn't want to upset her boyfriend either. And the boyfriend, I sat with Dylan years after the case was solved, when we were putting together some material, and he was talking about Jason Downie, actually quite friendly and jovial about it, saying that this guy wouldn't hurt a fly, and he never had any suspicions about him, and he didn't have any concerns about his girlfriend being interested in Jason Downie. But in Jason Downie's mind, his girlfriend, Chantelle Rowe, was interested in him, and it was reciprocated, and that's that volcano or that firestorm that built up, and he was there to take what he thought was his.
So really, at the end of the day, this was a sexual obsession or an infatuation with Chantelle. And
a desire for, I guess, affection and attention, a cry for help. A cry for help. I guess he felt quite alone, and it has been suggested that Chantelle had continued to message him and be polite to him and things like that, and he took that as, she's interested in me, and built that up in his own mind, I think. And we don't really know what happened behind those closed doors and what sparked that frenzy, but it would appear that rejection and being told that this isn't happening, he snapped.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with journalist Bryan Littlely about the Kapunda triple murder. Up next, Bryan tells us about how the arrest of Jason Downie unfolded. How did his arrest go down in the end?
So we know that it had been 8 days or so since that murder. 3 people stabbed more than 100 times, violently, like one of the most violent murders and scenes that police have seen. Jason Downie had throughout that time been working at the Tanunda Mechanics as an apprentice, where he was a lowly apprentice. Each day he ride-shared with someone else, another young person from Kapunda who worked at the same mechanics, and they'd ride-share and go across the 30-odd kilometres from Kapunda to Tanunda. And Jason had continued to, as he normally would, catch a lift with his work colleague and catch a lift back with his work colleague. And police, having acted on a hunch about information that Sergeant John Keane had picked up when interviewing Jason Downie, he'd made a point that he tried to make an alibi for where he was. He wasn't at this party on the Saturday night. Yes, he knew Chantelle, but he kept making the point that he wasn't at this party. And I went to McDonald's down in Gawler and got some food. So on Sunday, that's where I was. So he made this alibi, and he was insistent on it. And John Keane had picked up, going, it's odd, he keeps offering up this alibi. If he hasn't got anything to hide, why would he be, volunteering this information? So they did start to check him out, and they were closing in on him, obviously, and they knew that they had someone who was a suspect here by matching shoe prints and doing some actual detective work, matching fingerprints. They started to think that this could be the guy. So they got the colleague who was working with Jason that time in Tanunda. They said, we'll get you to bring him in to come in and sign his we'll just tell him that he's going to sign the statement. And, it's played out since in the weeks after that. These mechanics in the workshop at lunchtime were sort of joking with Jason Downie. They're going, they're going to arrest you for those murders. And these are the same colleagues that just a few days before were thinking, hey, this guy's acting a bit dodgy. He's got cuts on his hands as well. He's trying to explain some things that had happened, and enough to take a photograph of him at their Christmas dinner to say, we suspect this guy's done this. And they were joking with him. I can't imagine how nerve-wracking that drive for that young person who was driving to deliver him directly to the police station must have been, knowing that, I'm driving a person back to the police station that we all suspect has done it, and we've been joking around with it. And of course, Jason Downie knows what he's done, doesn't he?
He's shown how dangerous he is. So to put that person in that position.
That's right. And there was no suggestion at the time, and there's no suggestion that they were being followed by a police patrol, unmarked car or anything like tracked to that. It was just, I thought that was bizarre that police did that, but it did work out for them. He went there and they got their man. So, I don't think it'd be the number one way of bringing in a suspect who's committed that sort of crime. So,
and Jason's name was suppressed for a while, wasn't it? Why was that? Because he was 18 at the time of his arrest.
Yeah, I think I can't really explain the legal reasons why it was suppressed, but I think it was matching up. There were things that hadn't been found, like so. Chantelle's phone was missing, and we know that there was a message sent from that phone that sort of told them they apparently never found the phone. They hadn't found a murder weapon. There was suggestions that I guess his identity suppressed. There's still a lot of talk about the fact that could one person do this? He wasn't a very strong guy. He wasn't a big guy. He's quite a weedy, weak-looking, insipid 18-year-old. He's managed to overpower Andrew, and that was no mean feat. So there was still this talk: was there another person involved? Did he have an accomplice and things like that? So, plus small town, you want to control the narrative or want to control the information that's coming out. So my only thinking is that that's why it was suppressed. They're also chasing guilty plea from him. So that would be the hope to, I guess, limit the amount of pain for Christopher and that community of Kapunda.
The appearance of Downie really did kind of shock people, didn't it? When he was eventually kind of revealed to be this killer because of the brutality. And it just goes to show that, anyone can be a killer.
Well, it really does, because, he wasn't the obvious choice, was he? He, if you have a look at that footage of him placing those flowers, he's a weak-looking 18-year-old boy, and to have that brutality in someone so young as well, to have that amount of rage that must have taken, like it doesn't match the persona, it doesn't match the person at all, the crime.
Tell me about the strange rumour that was kind of circulating once his name did come out.
Yeah, look, I guess that is probably what we're touching on this, the crime doesn't match. People are looking for answers as to how this young man could possibly be responsible for such a brutal crime. And so the rumours started coming out, and we're flowing that he matched the identity of the James Bolger killers. So he'd come from Kilmarnock, and if you know the story of James Bolger, a 2-year-old boy in the UK in 1993, taken off in a shopping centre by 2 10-year-olds who tortured him, held him hostage, and then murdered him, Robert Thompson and John Venables. Now, in 2001, they were released with new identities, and there was quite a bit of talk that Robert Thompson, who disappeared off the face of the planet, really. There was talk that he'd been relocated to Australia. Now, in 2006, Jason Downie and his mum and their family landed in Kapunda, like emigrated to Kapunda. And there's a bit of a resemblance in just general sort of, if you looked at them and the ages were matching up. And that rumour went around and was thoroughly checked out by media organisations and proven to not be the case, obviously. But it probably the speculation about, or the consideration that how could someone have so much rage? They went to match it to someone who's done something so violent and vulgar in the past.
Can we talk about the evidence that was gathered against Downie? You mentioned DNA. So they had, a lot of blood. They had fingerprints. They had footprints, semen. What else did they have against him?
Going through police reports on what they did gather, and a fingerprint that was almost accidentally gathered. They were dusting one space on the inside of Chantelle's bedroom door, a location that they were looking at, and a bit of the dust, the fingerprint dust, was misplaced. It was sort of drifted off somewhere else, and it landed on a fingerprint, which was a fantastic thumbprint, I think, that they were able to lift. So they had that there. And they had that fairly early on, but of course, Jason Downie didn't have a criminal record or anything, so they had nothing. They had a fingerprint. Eventually, was going to prove vital, crucial. There's also the shoe prints that were left around in the blood that he'd tried to cover up at one stage, and he'd walked out and he was so not calculated, but working in that scene. It's such an odd thing. He'd try to clean up some blood, then he went back and stabbed people. He took his shoes off at one stage and walked around in bare feet, in socks, I should say, and put these different sock-covered footprints around the place. And he left there with his shoes off, and they've never been found. So they managed to. His mum had revealed that he only had 3 pairs of shoes, so they matched shoe prints from a pair that was missing. Like one of those pairs was missing, but all of that stuff was what ultimately secured that conviction and all that evidence against him. But the one thing that they didn't find was the knife, and it was a kitchen knife taken from the Rowe family's house. So he didn't go there with a weapon from everything we know. He took it, and this sort of, I guess, raises the point that this was a snap. He didn't go there with the intent to kill them, but that's how it happened. The police line on that is that they never found that knife. They never found the murder weapon. But I'd question that as well. Those months later, and it happened to be on a day that Jason Downie was facing court, and from my memory, it was a day that he entered his plea. It'd been horrific for the family members in the community, and of course the legal system. The prosecutors were all hoping for that day to end that, get a guilty plea and try to stem that flow of pain for that community.
You mentioned that he entered a plea, and it ended up being, a year later after the murders. So before that, he was kind of maintaining his innocence, wasn't he? He even had kind of a strange story about why there might have been his fingerprint there. Yeah.
There was a lot of that, and I think that's why when it did come out, it's not real clear what his story was. I certainly say myself, I didn't closely follow those back and forth, so it got out of my hands as the investigative guy on the ground, and it was really in our court reporter's hands. He was trying to give reason for not being there, so I think the police probably explain it better, and I've heard that they were keenly getting those fingerprints and keenly getting these bits and pieces, and they wanted to really make sure they had that forensic stuff. Having the shoe prints and having the fingerprint and having multiple bits of forensic evidence meant that they could shut down if he did want to say, hey, but I've been there in the past. And the police made it quite clear that, and Dylan Pratt has also said that he rarely had gone inside that house to see Chantelle. He wasn't welcome there. Jason Downie had met Christopher Rowe once a few weeks before the murder, and Christopher, who has shared that he would normally, shake someone's hand. He obviously had a bit of a feeling about Jason Downie because he didn't shake his hand, he said. So I think they stacked up the storyline that there was no great possibility that Jason Downie had been a regular person inside that Harriet Street house. So his alibis or his whatever story he made up wasn't really going to sit tight.
So he did plead guilty, which obviously saves Chris and the other family members from having to go through the ordeal of a trial. I want to talk about Jason's apology letter, if you can talk to that, because I've seen it described as a childlike reaction to a horrendous crime, which I think is a very fitting description.
Yeah, it was. He called it, my recent actions was the way he described killing 3 people. So it was not an apology. It was, and there's no contrition, there's no remorse in it. I mean, it was the writings of a child and a person who had no comprehension of what he did. Now, I'm sure Jason Downie did comprehend what he'd done. He knew what he'd done, but I'm sure he didn't get advice on how to write that letter because that apology letter, because it didn't hit. It only hurt that family. He was upset. He wrote in there, like, before this, before my recent actions, I had a good job, I had a good car, and I had a good social life, and I've lost all of that because of my recent actions. So he didn't get it.
So Downie ended up getting 35 years, which to me, knowing what he did and knowing how many people he killed, doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually a very significant penalty in South Australia, isn't it?
Yeah, that is. There's only been one higher, I believe, and that's Michael Barry Fife, the Birdman of Yatala, they call him. I think he got a total of 38 years, but that's 35 years before he has any chance of parole. It doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to get out.
After the break, we find out where Christopher Rowe is now and whether he's been able to move on from the murder of his family. Back to Chris again, because, you were the one of the only, or if only the only journo to kind of have extensive chats with him. And another kind of insight he gave you was the amount of debt that these murders left him in and the kind of lack of help he was given.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to it, but I do think, so the Victims of Crime Levy is there to help pick up some of those pieces. But you can imagine Christopher couldn't work for 2 years, really, couldn't have a normal life. And even after the sentencing and everything, there's no normality. It's hard to get back to any normal life there. And the trauma, trying to deal with it with counselling and trying to just make day-to-day happen and get around is going to cost you a great deal of money. I think there's hold-ups with estates as well. That's going to happen in situations like that. So he's really back against the wall type stuff. And the Victims of Crime Levy that was paid out to, I guess, the family, it wasn't even paid out to Chris. He wasn't considered a victim of crime because he wasn't there. He wasn't a victim of it. He lost his whole family. And I think the total amount was $23,000 from Victims of Crime Levy, which has got millions of dollars in it, mind you. Every time you break the law, obviously, there's that levy you're paying on top of your fine. It was $7,000 per life taken, and then some money to clean up the crime scene, the house, for sale or for, also it could later be sold. And that was a compensation that the Rowe family got. that Christopher Rowe got. So there was no compensation for Christopher for losing his family.
You did say that there was, somewhat of a happy ending for Chris. He and his partner had a little baby boy together, and as far as you know, they're living a happy life now?
Oh, look, I know that it was very up and down for the couple, and I know that they did have a little baby, and that was wonderful. And I do believe they had a second child together, but I don't. I don't know for sure, but I don't believe that they continued in a partnership. But I think they've always continued to support each other. So I don't know that they're together anymore. But certainly, my last contact with them, which was some years ago, was that they're still very supportive, and they have a huge amount of support still, ongoing support from that Kapunda community, and they wrap their arms around Christopher and Coralie and their family and each other as well, because there's so many people that were very, very much hurt within that community for a whole myriad of reasons, not just because they lost friends, but because the impact that such a crime would have on a community.
He isn't an Australian citizen. He's originally from Scotland, as we've mentioned. So if and when he does get out, will he stay here? Will he be able to settle in Australia, or does he get kind of kicked out of the country?
Yeah, he would be extradited, was at the point of him being sentenced and going to jail. That was the status then, that, if ever he did get out or was released, parole after 35 years, it would be extradition for him.
Right. And I believe that there was a bit of media public resistance kind of happening at the thought of that as well from Scotland, who said they didn't want him.
Yeah, there seemed to be that coming from across the way there. That no, you can keep him. He's been there since he was a child. He did this. He's one of yours. He's not one of ours. So I think from memory, that's where there was plenty of resistance. Well, I had a bit to do with chasing. He's got a half sister back in Scotland. I think Jodie was a half sister. Jason Downie's father is not even on his birth certificate, so I'm not sure that he doesn't know the identity of his father. So Kilmarnock was a pretty tough, rough and tumble place as well. So there's no doubt that this lad had a pretty tough upbringing or hard life. He was uprooted and emigrated to Australia, didn't like Kapunda and things like that. But, he doesn't really have a place. His place is in jail at the moment.
Has the stain of this crime affected Kapunda long term? Unfortunately, still to this day, it's kind of referred to as the Kapunda triple murder. It's got the town's name in its kind of title. Has it affected the town?
I would say it certainly had some impact on it, but they're pretty good people, and they're able to pick up the pieces pretty well. So, it was in 2010, and for that first decade, definitely. I think that they've done a really good job of filtering that out and washing, cleansing themselves of that. But you're right, it's still the Kapunda triple murder. If someone asked me about the Rowe family murders, it's the Kapunda murders. It's not unlike Snowtown. Truro is just down the road. Truro, a town with a secret. Kapunda hasn't earned that sort of title. The murders are always going to be known as the Kapunda triple murders.
How do you reflect on your time investigating this story? Did it have a big impact on you at the time? And do you think about it often, or is it one of those ones that you've been able to let go?
No, I don't think I let go of any of the crimes that I have investigated, and there's been some horrific ones, which does take an impact, and Kapunda certainly does. I think doing this now is a great reminder. I've got a 15-year-old daughter, I reflect at the time. She was just a child, and I'd softened a fair bit because I had been the pretty hard-nosed journo out to get the scoop all the time out there, and I'd actually softened it, and I really felt this violence against a young girl that hurt me. It made me hungry to find out what happened as well. So a bit of a mix of being the journo and the dad, I guess, and the community member, and I felt that I had that strong connection to the community out there as well. I felt that I was in my role serving that community and my state to be able to try to tell this story in a way that was, accurate and fulsome and also carried some compassion with it. So it does stick with me quite a bit as one of the cases that, I'll never forget it and the emotions I had around it while I was doing it. And there's some times where you're just blown away and you do want to go off and have a bit of a cry as well. And that doesn't matter how tough a bloke you think you are, that's okay.
Thanks to Bryan for helping us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Brown. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.